In the previous video, we talked about the good sample being representative of the population, but we also indicated that taking a good sample is difficult. And the reason we wanted to take a good sample is so that we could make generalizations about the population. But unfortunately, it's really difficult to do. And just give you a simple little survey here, and without thinking about it, I'd like you to take a choice between 1, 2, 3, or 4. So I'm going to pause for just a half a second while you make that choice. Don't think long and hard about it and write it down. Now, when I ask you to do that, most people, actually the survey says, or having done this over and over again, about 75% of the people choose 3. And you're like, okay, so what? So I choose 3. Only about 5% choose 1. But if you think about it, there are 4 numbers there. So this shouldn't be chosen 75% of the time. It should have been chosen 25%. So this should be chosen 25. This is chosen 25. This is chosen 25. And this is chosen 25. But it turns out 3 is overrepresented. And that's what bias is overrepresenting a component of the population in the sample. So the very fact that 3 shows up 75%, or about 3 times more than it should, shows that we're biased towards 3 and biased against number 1. Now, I know you're going, well, this is a stupid example because it's only 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I'm going to, no, actually, this has a great practical applications in your life. If you go to the bathroom and you notice that there's 4 stalls, the one that doesn't get used is number 1. Everyone walks by number 1 and they skips it. And you go, so? And I said, well, if they skip it, that means it's the clean one. It's the one that's not used. In this time of COVID and hygiene, probably want to choose the clean stall. It also means that stall number 3 is always going to be out of toilet paper and stinky. So there actually is an importance to it. But the main thing is to know that we can't use our judgment because we actually all have some amount of bias on certain things. We prefer something, so we overrepresent and underrepresent parts of the population. We cannot, and we don't want that. Now, we have multiple types of bias. And by the way, bias is the result of a bad study design. Okay, it's the result of a bad study design. We may not think it is a bad study design, but that's what it's the result of. And basically, because of the bad study design or the bad execution of the study, we end up getting something that overrepresents part of the population and underrepresents part of the population. Typically speaking, we want to say that bias is almost systematic. Okay, we want to say that it's systematic. In other words, if we really thought about it, we could probably predict how it's going to overrepresent and underrepresent different parts of the population. So common types of statistical bias are undercoverage bias. And undercoverage bias occurs when members of a population are not able to be selected or chosen for the sample because they're not able to be accounted for. Consider this. It's very difficult to survey the homeless because we don't see them, all right? There have been times that people weren't able to be reached because they didn't have a landline phone line. And guess what? We're back to that time. It used to be only the affluent had phones and they'd have landline phones in their homes. But most of us don't even use a landline unless we're using it in order to get cell service or to get TV cable. But we generally don't, most people aren't even using a landline anymore. So landlines means that they can't reach us. And in my own house, yes, we have a landline, but we don't have a phone hooked up to it. So if someone were to dial that number, they could never get us, which means my family would never be represented. All right. Non-response bias. Non-response bias occurs when a member of the population is randomly identified. So in other words, we selected the person correctly, but they either refuse to participate in the poll or choose not to return the survey. That makes me think of the PTA packets. Basically, we sent them out to everybody, but we know they're not all going to be returned. So non-response bias is when we actually randomly, we made a selection, we have a good selection process, but people choose not to respond. Also, when I was growing up as a kid, it was typical for surveys to be done over the phone. And people would call, they would ask a question, and back in the day, everyone was comfortable answering questions over the phone in a survey, and they actually felt kind of important that they got polled. These days, we all hang up on them. We're afraid, and we're afraid to open up over the phone, and that's non-response bias, and we choose not to answer. Most polls that we run into are subject to voluntary response bias. And voluntary response bias means there was no randomness in the selection process of the people. And these are the type of polls that show up on the internet or surveys or telephone call-in. So you'd be watching a television show and they go, do you support this? Do you support that? What's your favorite song? And it goes like this on the favorite song in the radio when they have two songs that you're like, oh, this is my favorite song. This is when I met Johnny. It was so wonderful, etc. 3 weeks later, you've broken up and you hate the song. The only people that actually call into those things, and the only ones who fill in the polls on the internet, those types of polls, are the majority, not all the only ones. The majority of those people, or we tend to overrepresent those with strong feelings. Those that love the song, those that hate the song, those that love Donald Trump and think that all the cosmic tumblers aligned when he was selected, and those that think that he's the orange Satan. All right, so we overrepresent those with extreme opinions, and we miss out on the middle, the meh. All right. Those that don't have strong opinions. Why? Because they don't care enough to even respond. The thing is, on a voluntary response bias, is we posted it out there, but we did not do any random selection to make sure that we represent the people. Then we get to one of my favorite, and this is the one that I'm absolutely guilty of all the time. I've used it multiple times this year already. It's a habit I try to break, but I'm guilty of it. And this is response bias. And this results from questions that are embarrassing, sensitive, or non-neutral, or poorly worded, which due to their phrasing tend to lend people to a particular response. And so basically, if it's a sensitive question or embarrassing question, people either will lie or they will be tricked into lying. And the way the best thing I can do is give you a couple of examples of this. So Coach Cam runs an outstanding football program, and he will frequently ask the team if any one of them has stayed out partying that weekend. And it's amazing. Coach Ham has such great control over his athletes that none of them have. None of them have. They've all said that no, that they have not. Well, obviously, that type of question, because of the way it's what it is, and they're afraid of being in trouble with Coach Ham and having their bodies hurt, having to do all sorts of exercises. If they've been out partying, they lie. Okay, so that's an example of a sensitive question. In my own case, I will sit there and go, does that make sense? I'll ask something to the class and then I'll explain it. I've done what I think is a really good job and say, so does that make sense? And none of my students ever tell me it doesn't make sense. They're all so polite. And I know that I didn't make sense sometimes. But I was hoping I had, and looking for feedback, but because you are nice and don't want to say, hey, Mr. Spencer, you've been talking up there for 30 minutes and we ain't got no idea what you've been saying. All right. So consequently, when I say doesn't make sense, that's actually going to be a response bias type question. And I do it frequently. It's kind of my go-to problem that I have. Another thing is the way you phrase a question can change the results. Now, I don't have to change everybody's results. I just need to change if I change some of the results, then I've swayed it or I've biased it. For example, try this. Are you in favor of providing school lunches for children that do not have enough to eat so that they have a chance to have a normal life? And the majority of people would say, yes, I am in favor of doing that because I care about children. I want them to have normal lives. I want them to grow up and be good citizens. Same topic, different way of phrasing the question. Are you in favor of the government raising your taxes and taking your money away to pay for food for people who don't work? And you can sit there and go, well, no, I'm not in favor of that. Well, both of them are having to do with food, but one of them's like I'm helping and the other I'm taking away. And as a result, I can swing the poll. So wording a question is very important. That's called response bias. And these definitions, you do need to make sure you know these. And the main ones that you need to know are undercoverage bias, non-response bias. Undercoverage means because of the type of person, usually homeless or something like that, I'm not able to reach them, but they're not in my sample. I have no way. Non-response bias, they choose not to respond. Voluntary response bias, they weren't randomly selected and they choose to, and anyone can respond, and those with strong opinions do. And response bias is a poorly worded question or a question that is sensitive in nature. And basically, if it's poorly worded, you're misled you are misled, and so you don't represent your true belief, or it's a sensitive question and you basically lie. All right, we're going to do some scenarios here in our next two videos.